So thanks a lot for the invite, and for actually I'll start by thanking you two and the rest of the Breaking Convention team for arranging this. I think it actually has been deeply inspiring so far, and to the people who have been speaking all day, I found it very important topics, and that also makes me throw in very early on here a disclaimer for my own talk, where I'll be using boring conventional slides matching my boring conventional outfit. Nothing about ethics, nothing about indigenous wisdom and use and culture. No lighthouse. Give me a lighthouse. So that's my opening disclaimer. You can see it already starts really bad. Even being an advisor for some of the companies is just like, oh, but at least it's up there. So I have been working alongside the team at Imperial for 12 years now, as a psychiatrist and as a neuroscientist. So it's all about the brain, everything. Forget about the body. Yeah. So and there's also this event today is gonna probably be the last time that we will all be together with our dear Robin, who's been heading and founding the center that we are now driving forward together as a team, and also thankfully still David Knott have promised to stay some more years instead of retiring. We have convinced him to do that, so we are also appreciative of that. But anyway, I'll start the talk, and when I completely missed that it was all about ethics, so I thought I'm just going to continue where I stopped 2 years ago, because 2 years ago I was speaking at Breaking Convention about microdosing and managed to blah blah for probably also 30 minutes without ever getting to any results, because we didn't have any. And I thought I'm just going to continue where I stopped 2 years ago and show some results, and then in the end of this talk about stuff where we don't have any results, in the hope that I'll be invited back next time to continue. So I'll just keep on putting teasers and then hope to be invited back. So this is basically the continuation of the talk from 2 years ago, with a little recap, as in like when you see TV shows, you have a little quick summary. So microdosing, as everybody probably know, is the repeated use of low doses of psychedelics. So around 5-10% of the normal full psychedelic doses, used a few times a week, typically over a longer period. And whether it's sub-perceptual levels or not, that can be argued, because it depends on where you are in the microdosing range. And whether microdoses are actual real microdoses can also be argued, and probably they're not. Actually, they are not in pharmacological terms. They are more mini doses because they have more effects on the brain and on the receptor systems than they would if they were microdoses in pharmacological terms. But anyway, that is microdosing, and a little bit about this thing about the pharmacology and why they are not real microdoses is evidence from this work, which is PET imaging. So in the living human brain, you can measure the receptors, the 2A receptor in the serotonin system, which is a key receptor for the action of psychedelics, and you can measure different doses of psilocybin. How much does a given dose affect or block or sit on these receptors? And there we can see that the doses that people are using in the psychedelic microdosing range, they actually have proper potential pharmacological effects, because they are affecting around 20, 30, sometimes up to even 40% of the receptors, which is way more than we talk about when we talk about pharmacological microdoses, that it would only be a couple of percent of receptors max. So that gives some points to the idea that maybe microdosing could have proper pharmacological and therefore potentially therapeutic effects. And there's tons of evidence in terms of anecdotal evidence that is the case. People do report in anecdotes, and also when you collect a lot of anecdotes, then it looks a bit better in terms of evidence, but basically it's still just a lot of anecdotes. But if you do that, then people report increased energy, well-being, cognition, concentration, management of stress, and also increased creativity, which is in a way a bit how the microdosing became very popular in Silicon Valley, that people used it to stimulate their creativity and so on. So all that is being described, reported, published also in popular books and on a lot of internet forums, in Reddit. People's own experiences are all supporting this, and even also therapeutic potential, decreased anxiety, depression, and help to treat addictions and also pain. So really quite exciting, and something that obviously as a scientist, it's difficult to completely ignore, and particularly since we are actually studying psychedelics. So therefore we thought we also would like to try to find out, what is this about? Is there actually effects of microdosing, or is it just a hype, basically? So looking at some of this early evidence, again, very anecdotal, very retrospective data collection, there are also negative, and that's important also, of course, to focus and zoom in on that. There are also negative reports coming out of the microdosing literature, including some increases in neuroticism, which is a vulnerability marker for affective disorders, so depression, anxiety, and so on, has been seen in one microdosing study. And then this is not to say that psychedelics used repeatedly, as it is in microdosing, is harming the heart, but it's something that hasn't been ruled out. And the reason why we and others are even thinking about that is that previous drugs that have been on the market that stimulate some of the same receptors that psychedelics do stimulate, because it's not all about the 2A receptor in the brain, there are also 2B receptors in the body. So actually now I went out of the brain and into the body, even though I said I didn't, but it's only in the scary way, that potentially if you repeatedly stimulate the 2B receptor, it could maybe be harmful for the heart valves, because other drugs have been taken off the market previously from stimulating that receptor. There's no evidence to support that this is the case, but obviously a good thing to study. That won't be us, but other people will be studying that, and that makes a lot of sense. So this is what I talked about the last time, and that was this survey, and that's not much better than anecdotes, but it's at least prospective. So here is a non-controlled study, people who were planning to do microdosing with their own drug on their own initiative. They could sign up before they were engaging in the microdosing to give their consent online, and then fill out questionnaires and so on online before they started the microdosing, and then during the period where they were microdosing, and some follow-up time points afterwards. But no control conditions, so no placebo. And basically, now I'll skip, so I don't give exactly the same talk as 2 years ago, so I'll skip more details about it, but just give you the results. That it basically confirms that it looks pretty good. It looks like that well-being is increasing, and some of the bad stuff like depression symptoms measured with this QIDS measure and anxiety measured with this STAI measure, that they are going down. So basically confirming these anecdotal evidence and retrospective evidence of microdosing potentially have some beneficial effects. So that's all good. However, when we looked at, because we also collected information about people's expectations about having effects, we could see that there was a predictive element of that expectation that people had. So if you control for that, then the results were less brilliant. So that points to the in the direction of there is some placebo/expectation going on. That is part of it. At least it could be. That's how this study sort of concluded. And when we look at this is sort of in line, the results were in line with other non-controlled retro and also other prospective survey studies. Again, that means without any placebo control. Basically, these positive results showed the same thing. In terms of evidence, and this is sort of a pyramid hierarchy of evidence where you have sort of anecdotes pretty low, and then big meta-analysis where you compile all very controlled science and put it all together, that's up in the top. It's sort of on around that level. If you want to go a bit further up, then you can put in a control condition like a placebo control. And that had only been done before we did our next study. It had only been done in acute single doses. So that's very interesting, but it's not proper microdosing. It's not what people are doing out in the real world. But in terms of evidence, a bit stronger. But basically, those studies, although there was some positive findings, the main key factors that everybody is interested in, whether does it actually make people feel better and so on, very negative findings. So they didn't find much in these controlled acute single dose studies in the microdosing range. So that means that what about proper repeated psychedelic microdosing? What about that? So we came up with, together with Balazs Getty, a colleague who works in our team, he came up with this idea that people could blind themselves, so they could placebo control themselves out in their own home with their own compounds and make a placebo condition. So therefore we launched another survey, this one, and this is the one I didn't have results from, but then now we do. So that's what I'm going to show here. So it was published earlier this year in eLife, one of the scientific journals. And we called it self-blinding because people blinded themselves, but we also call it citizen science because it is obviously sort of very sort of democratic involvement and full of trust that people, if they stuck to that manual and didn't sort of cheat and look into the envelopes that they were creating to break the blind and understand what they were actually taking, whether it was placebo or whether it was their originally planned microdosing. So there was a lot of trust. So it's a citizen science kind of method, much cheaper than doing a conventional clinical trial, because if you want to study it properly, you would need to hand out the drugs, hand out the placebo, which is difficult with a controlled drug. You can't really give people for 4 weeks. Then they would have to come in on, and can you even let them take it at home? No, they probably have to do it in the lab. We were in a sort of dead end in constructing such a trial, and extremely expensive and very complicated. And also, if you work in Google and you want to stimulate your creativity, you probably don't want to come into our lab 3 times a week for 4 weeks and sitting there on a sub-perceptual dose. We wanted to study it in a naturalistic setting. So therefore, we used this manual that Balazs developed together with our team at Imperial, and we got through Imperial ethics, a bit surprisingly, but we did. And basically, people planned. They planned the regime, they constructed the regime, put it into capsules, and then they made placebo versions of the same thing. So they created, instead of creating 4 weeks regime, they created 8 weeks. So 4 weeks was the original, what they had planned already, and then four other envelopes, each envelope represented a week, was a placebo version of the whole thing. And then they mixed them in a certain way, the envelopes, so they ended up only using 4 of the envelopes and disregarding 4 other envelopes. And they did not know what they were doing. They did not know what they ended up taking, but statistically we had piloted, we knew that a third of the participant would be microdosing for the 4 week, a third would be taking placebo for the 4 week period, and then there was a mixed group in the middle that would take microdosing 1 week, placebo, and microdosing placebo over the 4 weeks. But then in each envelope there was a QR code that they printed out and put into these envelopes, so they could scan it through an app, and then we knew what was in their envelope, but they didn't. So basically, and I can say that it's smart because it was Balazs' idea, but quite smart. And then there were 200 people who did this. And normally when we do these surveys, people drop out. People, I don't know, lose interest, get bored. But because they had to put such a massive effort in, and there was this carrot in the end that they could be told, they could get some results and be told whether they actually took microdosing for the vote or whether it was placebo. So they were engaged more than in our other surveys. So that was another benefit, that there were fewer people dropping out in this one. So almost 200 people went through the whole thing all over the world. We never met them. It was just through online survey and email contact, mainly Balazs overseeing it and communicating with people. And then right to the results. When we look at the microdosing, you can see here, this is basically sort of increase in scores of mindfulness. And you can see it goes up, and that's great. And it's statistically significant. So that means people improve in terms of mindfulness. And this is just the red curve. And that means this is just the people who actually did take microdosing for the 4 week. However, the placebo group, they also improved. And suddenly the improvement were not separating statistically. So that means in a way it's a negative trial if it was about mindfulness. And you see here, it was the same thing for all the different outcomes. So basically a negative trial. That means that you do see improvements, but you see similar improvements that do not statistically differ in the placebo condition. Then we had, there was a relatively complex design, so we could also measure what people would doing on the day. So every day where they took something, they didn't know what they were taking, but we asked them to guess what they were taking, and we could then assess how were they doing on these days through this online tasking. And the interesting thing was that if people, so you can see down the bottom, the condition, that's what people actually had in the capsule on the day. And then guess was what they guessed they took on the day. So if they took placebo and guessed it was placebo, they didn't have much improvement, and didn't differ if they actually took a microdose but thought it was placebo. That means there was no improvement. You can see that it is a bit higher, but it does not separate. It's not statistically different. However, if they took placebo, so they actually took placebo, but they thought it was a microdose, then they improved. And if they took a microdose and thought it was microdose, they also improved. So we were quite glad that we asked, to be honest, because often in trials you don't ask people what they thought they were taking. We don't really often assess. Also, when you do SSRI trials for depression, you forget to ask whether people actually thought they were taking in the period. And you can see here that probably is quite an important thing to remember to ask, because we can see that it is pretty driven by what people think they are taking. Maybe in particular something that is as hyped, full of optimism, positive, maybe also from the rest of the full dose science, from bestseller books, from a lot of Reddit conversations. People really believe this work. It's also a bit of a subculture a bit against I don't know, conventional medicine, anti-establishment kind of thing in it. You are suddenly, that's part of your identity in the period where you microdose. You also do something that's illegal, so you need to put quite a lot of effort. Would you do that unless you really believed it would work? It has all the full-blown recipe for placebo effects. And that's what we're seeing here. And it's basically the same for everything apart from the more objective thing, which was the cognitive task performance. There, it doesn't really matter whether what people are guessing. That doesn't really separate them. That's a bit more objective than a scale that people fill out how they're feeling. So basically, the conclusion from that study is that both the acute and long-term benefits of microdosing seem to be explained by placebo-like expectation effects. So that's a bit of a bucket of cold water in the face of all of us. And also, we thought this study was to create some early, really cheap, smart evidence that we could use to then get more funds to do real trials. But so now instead we are just being hated by everybody because of this result. But hey, that's science for you. And then but we haven't given up. We're going to do it again, smaller scale, which is not that likely to see effects, but where we are going to try to do London area based, so not global, and then do some neuroscience where we can measure plasticity, we can measure different things, sleep quality, heart rate variability, a lot of fancy more neuroscience measures on top of it, where we try to enrich the population sample with people who are really trying to self-treat the depression. Because one of the big questions could be, hey, these were pretty healthy. What about people who actually suffer depression? Would that be different? When we look, because we already looked in the data set, and we can see that the people who were a bit depressed from baseline, who scored low on well-being, a bit on depression, and maybe high on neuroticism, all that as sort of depressed-like picture. If we only looked at those people, same picture, it didn't differ. Is it a difference between psilocybin and LSD? Approximately half, a bit more. We did LSD, I think, in our trial. It didn't differ. There was no difference between whether it was LSD or psilocybin. But we are going to explore it further and also see if we see the same thing when we do it again in a London-based. And then I just keep the TOAD logo in because that's a recent survey that we had launched. Actually, I can see on the website that we don't use the TOAD logo. That's a mistake. Anyway. Okay, and then the last part, this is now the teaser for 2 years. So some of the things that we are going to look into in the center at Imperial is different indications. Some of it that Robin and team working with Robin and also with myself and the others in the team are launching studies and have started already anorexia nervosa, a chronic pain study, and also soon we are going to start an OCD study. So different kinds of indications, and we also hope to do a more open label kind of thing where we do not care that much about the actual diagnosis, because these drugs and this therapy is very promising, and it seems to be promising across our conventional boxy way of, as psychiatrists, to put people in a box with a diagnosis. And maybe we should rather think about other things, impulsivity, reward deficiency, and all kinds of other things across diagnosis. A bit the RDoC model that I don't have time to sort of go into, but that's a sort of a movement in science to maybe not just study within the predefined category that are slightly arbitrary anyway and might change in the future. Also, single versus group is something we hope to be able to study more, and that not only because we want to stay in the brain and we want to be able to get grants and we want to be able to not get fired by Imperial. That's not the only reason why we are studying the brain. We also think that it adds value and that it is important, and we are curious enough to do it. So we are interested in exploring further some of the brain mechanisms. And I won't go into detail with this. It's just to show that we are building on experience in the team from combining imaging modalities. So we have very molecular imaging with PET, where we can measure transporters in the brain, receptors, and even release of neurotransmitters. And we are combining that with MRI, because together the different methods can add more than 1 + 1. We can understand the brain better by combining some of these imaging techniques that also obviously are from year to year advancing. So I won't go too much into detail, but we are both interested in the serotonin system and the dopamine system, also because we have very good tools to investigate those systems, and they are important systems of the brain, and we can use different tasks that we have expanded with very big awareness of where the psychedelics seem to have important effects, so that instead of just having cues of food and, for instance, gambling, we are enriching it also with social interaction, connection, nature cues, and art cues, in order to try to be able to develop tasks that can be used to try and understand some of the neurobiological underpinnings of how the psychedelics work. So I won't go again into extreme details here, because this is for the future, but we are doing some of it now without psychedelic intervention. We are doing a gambling study where we are tasking some of these paradigms in the reward system, where we have different hypotheses that it's too much to go into here, but we would like to test it before and after psychedelic intervention in addictions, and the gambling would be quite an appealing condition to try and test with these interventions, and also to test these systems, whether some of that sort of basically development of addiction has a learning, has a plasticity element where that is unhealthy in the reward systems, and where you end up in a very narrowed, over-focused on the saliency of what you're addicted to. And some of that we hope to be able to break with, and we can see that it works with the psychedelics in trials that others are doing, but whether it might be that we can rebroaden a narrowed reward spectrum in people with addiction. That's some of the things we would like to test. So this you already know, that the psychedelics are very promising from studies from us and a lot of other centers. But one of the things that we are a bit limited in is that we use a lot of questionnaires, that people who are participating will know. But what about the brain mechanism? So instead of using questionnaires alone, we would like to test some of the things with this nature relatedness and all that in the brain by tasking it and testing it. So that's what we're going to do in some of these studies, and I won't go too much into detail. But neuroplasticity is a very fancy word that is being studied also in the context of psychedelics and ketamine. The preclinical work showing that these drugs induce plasticity, which is very interesting and probably makes people even more sensitive to the setting and the context. But do these drugs induce plasticity in the brain? We are testing that with different new imaging techniques. There's some paradigms that we can use with EEG that can measure and induce and measure plasticity in the brain. We have preliminary data that I won't show because that's another teaser. Hannah Doctors now wrote for next year, but I guess that might be in 2 years. She won an essay competition, Brain Convention, on these data, because it shows that, yes, there's an increase in plasticity in the brain with that paradigm. And then we're using molecular imaging, also measuring synaptogenesis in the brain, and see whether these compounds are inducing that with imaging techniques. So some of it we are doing and is fully funded, and then some of it is wishful thinking, hoping that we will get funded to do it. Yeah, so we are doing this kind of gambling studies and testing different kinds of imaging ways of looking at plasticity after ketamine, and hope to be able to do it also with a psychedelic. And then the microdosing that I mentioned, we're also going to do a version 3 of, I guess, and yeah, and those. So, and then I want to just towards the end here mention that we now have a sister clinic to our center at Imperial. So we have all the way through been conducting our research at Hammersmith Hospital, which is basically a physical health hospital, where we have to sort of compete for rooms and, you know, a capacity with everybody else doing important other kind of physical health related research. But now we have our own clinic where we can do our own studies in mental health. So at St. Charles Hospital, which is within the Mental Health Trust called CMWL. So we have this new space where we also can create our own little blood lab, so we can also expand some of our work and measure peripheral markers of plasticity as well in these studies that we're going to do. So that's in Ladbroke Grove, close to where the center is at Hammersmith Hospital, but this is at St. Charles. So I would just finish here and thank all the amazing colleagues in the team, and I'm sure there might be some I've forgotten on this, which is difficult, and I apologize. But not the least Robin, and there's a specific thanks slide for Robin here because he's leaving our center. So thanks a lot.